Good morning, guys. Today we are going to start reading one of the 56 short stories, original short stories that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes. This one's called The Adventure of the Speckled Band, and it's got a little bit of everything. It's got the locked room problem, how did a murder happen when the room was locked from the inside. It's got all of your traditional elements of what makes a detective story. So you'll remember that one of the 6 elements of the detective story is a limited point of view. So all of these stories are told by Watson, right? So it's as if we're sitting down with Sherlock Holmes' assistant, who is after the fact, because all of this happened in the past. Maybe we're just having a meal with Watson or something, and he's telling us about how the case unfolded. So when you see me, right? That's Watson talking to us about how he observed Sherlock Holmes. That's important because if we were to see what Sherlock Holmes was thinking the whole time, right, we would lose a lot of the suspense. We would lose a lot of the mystery. So this is the adventure of the Speckled Band. To set the scene, at the time, Sherlock Holmes and Watson are roommates in a flat in London, 221 Baker Street. And they have a housekeeper who, when the doorbell rings in the morning, gets them up out of bed, and apparently it's time to work. So let's begin. On glancing over my notes of the 70-odd cases in which I have, during the last 8 years, studied the methods of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I find many tragic, some comic, a large number merely strange, and none commonplace. For working as he did rather for the love of his art than for the acquirement of wealth, he refused to associate himself with any investigation that did not tend towards the unusual and even the fantastic. Of all these varied cases, however, I cannot recall any which presented more singular features than that which was associated with the well-known Surrey family of the Roylotts of Stoke Moran. The events in question occurred in the early days of my association with Holmes, when we were sharing rooms as bachelors in Baker Street. It is possible that I might have placed them upon record before, but a promise of secrecy was made at the time, from which I have only been freed during the last month by the untimely death of the lady to whom the pledge was given. It is perhaps as well that the fact should now come to light, for I have reason to know that there are widespread rumors as to the death of Dr. Grimsby Roylott, which tend to make the matter even more terrible than the truth. Okay, so this opening paragraph doesn't even really start the story, right? It's Watson addressing directly to us, the reader, saying, this case happened a long time ago. I'm only now able to talk about it because the person that was involved just passed away. It was early in April, in the year 1883, that I woke one morning to find Sherlock Holmes standing fully dressed by the side of my bed. He was a late riser, as a rule, and as the clock on the mantelpiece showed me that it was only 7:15, I blinked up at him in some surprise and perhaps just a little resentment, for I was myself regular in my habits. "Very sorry to knock you up, Watson," said he, "but it's the common lot this morning. Mrs. Hudson has been knocked up," she retorted, "upon me, and I on you." Okay, so by knocked up, he means like the door has been knocked on, because they're all sleeping in. Apparently, you got to sleep in the 1800s past 7 o'clock. So, his housekeeper, somebody knocks on the door, wakes up the housekeeper. The housekeeper went and woke up Sherlock Holmes, and now Sherlock Holmes is waking up Watson. "What is it then, a fire?" "No, a client. It seems that a young lady has arrived in a considerable state of excitement, who insists upon seeing me. She is waiting now in the sitting room. Now, when young ladies wander about the metropolis at this hour of the morning and knock sleepy people up out of their beds, I presume that it is something very pressing which they have to communicate. Should it prove to be an interesting case, you would, I am sure, wish to follow it from the outset. Well, I thought, at any rate, that I should call you and give you the chance. Oh, my dear fellow, I would not miss it for anything. I had no keener pleasure than in following Holmes in his professional investigations, and in admiring the rapid deductions, as swift as intuitions, and yet always founded on a logical basis, with which he unraveled the problems which were submitted to him. I rapidly threw on my clothes and was ready in a few minutes to accompany my friend down to the sitting room. A lady dressed in black and heavily veiled, who had been sitting in the window, rose as we entered. "Good morning, madam," said Holmes cheerily. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my intimate friend and associate, Dr. Watson, before whom you can speak as freely as before myself." "Ha! I am glad to see that Mrs. Hudson has had the good sense to light the fire. Pray draw up to it, and I shall order you a cup of hot coffee, for I observe that you are shivering." "It is not cold which makes me shiver," said the woman in a low voice, changing her seat as requested. "Well, what then?" "It is fear, Mr. Holmes. It is terror." She raised her veil as she spoke, and we could see that she was indeed in a pitiable state of agitation. Her face all drawn and gray, with restless, frightened eyes like those of some hunted animal. Her features and figure were those of a woman of 30, but her hair was shot with premature gray, and her expression was weary and haggard. Sherlock Holmes ran her over with one of his quick, all-comprehensive glances. "You must not fear," said he soothingly, bending forward and patting her forearm. "We shall soon set matters right, I have no doubt. You have come in by the train this morning, I see." "You know me, then?" "Well, no. But I observed the second half of a return ticket in the palm of your left glove. You must have started early, and yet you had a good drive in a dog cart along heavy roads before you reached the station." The lady gave a violent start and stared in bewilderment at my companion. "Well, there is no mystery, my dear madam," said he, smiling. "The left arm of your jacket is spattered with mud in no less than 7 places. The marks are perfectly fresh. There's no vehicle save a dog cart which throws up mud in that way, and then only when you sit on the left-hand side of the driver. Whatever your reasons may be, you are perfectly correct," said she. "I started from home before 6, reached Leatherhead at 20 past, and came in by the first train to Waterloo. Sir, I can stand this strain no longer. I shall go mad if it continues." Okay. Establishment of the detective's expertise. We just had it there, right? So far, we don't even know what the mystery is. We don't know what the story is. All we know is that Sherlock Holmes has to get up early in the morning because some girl is trying to get a hold of him. He comes down into his office, sitting room or whatever, and he looks at her and says, "I see you came by train, but I see you live far out in the country because you had to ride a dog cart to the train station early this morning." She's like, "Wow, how do you know that?" You see this time and time again. He used his powers of observation to see the mud splatter. He recognized that that mud splattering up on her dress could only be done by a dog cart. Now, a dog cart is not a cart pulled by dogs. It's just the term for one of those little two-seated, carts. So, yeah. This is him. This is him already figuring out what the situation is before she even says anything. Just like Joe Bell. All right, so why is she here? She says, "I have no one to turn to. None. Save only one who cares for me, and he, poor fellow, can be of little aid. I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I have heard of you from Mrs. Farintosh, whom you helped in the hour of her sore need. It was from her that I had your address. Oh, sir, do you not think that you could help me, too, and at least throw a little light through the dense darkness which surrounds me? At present, it is out of my power to reward you for your services, but In a month or 6 weeks, I shall be married, with the control of my own income, and then at least you shall not find me ungrateful." Holmes turned to his desk and, unlocking it, drew out a small casebook, which he consulted. "Farintosh," said he. "Ah, yes, I recall the case. It was concerned with an opal tiara. I think it was before your time, Watson. I can only say, madam, that I shall be happy to devote the same care to your case as I did to that of your friend. As to reward, my profession is its own reward. But you are at liberty to defray whatever expenses I may be put to at the time which suits you best. And now, I beg that you will lay before us everything that may help us in informing our opinion upon the matter." "Alas," replied our visitor, "the very horror of my situation lies in the fact that my fears are so vague, and my suspicions depend so entirely upon small points, which might seem trivial to another, that even he to whom of all others I have a right to look for help and advice looks upon all that I tell him about it as the fancies of a nervous woman. He does not say so, but I can read it from his soothing answers and averted eyes. But I have heard, Mr. Holmes, that you can see deeply into the manifold wickedness of the human heart. You may advise me how to walk amid the dangers which encompass me." Okay, so she still has not told us what's wrong. All she said is she's scared, right? And that she doesn't have any solid reason to be scared. Just this vague sense that she should be scared. We've learned that she's going to get married in a couple weeks, right? So she's supposed to get married in 2 weeks, what was it? And that her fiance doesn't even really quite believe that she should be scared. That's all we know. So, let's get more detail. "I am all attention, madam. My name is Helen Stoner, and I am living with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran, on the western border of Surrey." Holmes nodded his head. "The name is familiar to me," said he. "The family was at one time among the richest in England, and the estates extended over the borders into Berkshire in the north and Hampshire in the west. In the last century, however, 4 successive heirs were of a dissolute and wasteful disposition, and the family ruin was eventually completed by a gambler in the days of the Regency. Nothing was left save a few acres of ground and the 200-year-old house, which is itself crushed under a heavy mortgage. The last squire dragged out of his existence there, living the horrible life of an aristocratic pauper. An aristocratic pauper. That's an oxymoron, right? What's a pauper? It's a poor beggar. It's a poor person, a beggar. An aristocrat is somebody who's very wealthy. So here is what she's saying. She comes from a rich family with a deep tradition in England. But over the last 100 years, it's all been squandered. It's all been spent. It's been gambled away. And all that's left is they still have the house. They still have the property. But they owe a ton of money. And he's an aristocratic pauper, right? So he runs in the social circles of the rich, but he doesn't really have any money. This is her stepfather. So we'll see how this keeps going. Her stepfather lives there. His only son, my stepfather, seeing that he must adapt himself to the new conditions, obtained an advance from a relative, which enabled him to take a medical degree, and went out to Calcutta, where by his professional skill and his force of character, he established a large practice. In a fit of anger, however, caused by some robberies which had been perpetrated in the house, he beat his native butler to death and narrowly escaped a capital sentence. As it was, he suffered a long term of imprisonment and afterward returned to England, A morose and disappointed man. You might remember from the Monkey's Paw, we talked about this. At the time, in the mid-1800s, England had colonized India. And so there were a lot of British people in India running the Indian government. So it would not be uncommon then for this guy from England to go to India, Calcutta, to establish a medical practice. And that's what he does. He decides he's going to become rich again, become a doctor, and so he starts a medical practice in India. This is a sign of the time. Something happens in his house. We're told there's a robbery in his house, and he beat his butler to death. So he gets imprisoned for that, but only for a little bit, sadly. And he comes back to England, a morose and disappointed man. When Dr. Roylott was in India, he married my mother, Mrs. Stoner, the young widow of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery. My sister Julia and I were twins, and we were only 2 years old at the time of my mother's remarriage. She had a considerable sum of money, not less than £1,000 a year, and this she bequeathed to Dr. Roylott entirely while we resided with him, with the provision that a certain annual sum should be allowed to each of us in the event of our marriage. Shortly after our return to England, my mother died. She was killed 8 years ago in a railway accident near Crewe. Dr. Roylott then abandoned his attempts to establish himself and practice in London and took us to live with him in the old ancestral house at Stoke Moran. The money which my mother had left was enough for all of our wants, and there seemed to be no obstacle to our happiness. Wow. This is a pretty convoluted backstory to her family, right? So her stepfather married her mother in India. Her mother was a widow because Helen, the woman who's sitting in the office right now, telling Holmes what's going on, her real dad was in the British Army and was killed. So her mother remarries this Dr. Roylott guy. They come back to England, and her mother is killed in a railway accident. So it's just stepdad and twin daughters. But her mother had money. So this money is bequeathed, and maybe you saw the word bequeathed in there as we were reading. That means that Dr. Roylott gets to control the money for the girls while the girls are still young. But the condition is once the girls are married, right, then they get their money. They get their mom's money. So he only gets to control it all the way up until when they are old enough to get married. Let's continue. But a terrible change came over our stepfather about this time. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbors, who had at first been overjoyed to see Roylott of Stoke Moran back in the old family seat, he shut himself up in his house and seldom came out save to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whoever might cross his path. Violence of temper approaching to mania has been hereditary in the men of the family, and in my stepfather's case it had, I believe, been intensified by his long residence in the tropics. A series of disgraceful brawls took place, 2 of which ended in the police court, until at last he became the terror of the village, and the folks would fly at his approach. For he is a man of immense strength and absolutely uncontrollable in his anger. Last week, he hurled the local blacksmith over a parapet into a stream, and it was only by paying over all the money which I could gather together that I was able to avert another public exposure. He had no friends at all, save the wandering gypsies, and he would give these vagabonds leave to encamp upon the few acres of bramble-covered land which represent the family estate, and would accept in return the hospitality of their tents, wandering away with them sometimes for weeks on end. He has a passion also for Indian animals, which are sent over to him by a correspondent. And he has at this moment a cheetah and a baboon, which wander freely over his grounds and are feared by the villagers almost as much as their master. Alright. Her stepfather has some weird friends, right? So we find out he's kind of a violent guy. He gets into bar fights a lot. Nobody likes him. But he has on his property gypsies. It's been a while since gypsies have kind of been in our popular culture. So let me refresh you on gypsies. Gypsies are a tribe of people. They consider themselves their own extended giant family who are nomadic. So they will stay in tents and they'll move around from place to place, often making money just by entertaining people. So they might come into a town, entertain that town for a few days, and then move along to the next town. Kind of like the precursor to a circus sometimes. But they really had established a reputation for being thieves. People would say the gypsies are coming, and that the gypsies would steal stuff from you. They'd pick your pockets when you were in town, and they really had a bad reputation that way. I had a grandmother who used to say, if you don't behave, we'll sell you to the gypsies. So there were rumors that, they would buy children, the gypsies would, off of poor families, and take these children and turn them into pickpockets and thieves and entertainers. So maybe you're familiar with them. Anyway, these gypsies are camped out at the stepfather's house. Like, they just set up tents in his backyard. Okay, well, we'll go a little further. You can imagine from what I say that my poor sister Julia and I had no great pleasure in our lives. No servant would stay with us, and for a long time we did all the work of the house. She was but 30 at the time of her death, and yet her hair had already begun to whiten, even as mine has. Your sister is dead then? She died just 2 years ago, and it is of her death that I wish to speak to you. You can understand that living the life which I have described, we were little likely to see anyone of our own age and position. We had, however, an aunt, my mother's maiden sister, Miss Honoria Westphale, who lives near Harrow, and we were occasionally allowed to pay short visits to this lady's house. Julia went there at Christmas 2 years ago and met there a half-pay major of the Marines, to whom she became engaged. My stepfather learned of the engagement when my sister returned and offered no objection to the marriage, but within a fortnight of the day which had been fixed for the wedding, the terrible event occurred, which has deprived me of my only companion. Sherlock Holmes had been leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed and his head sunk in a cushion, but he half opened his lids now and glanced across at his visitor. Pray, be precise as to the details, said he. Okay, this is where I'm going to pause today because Helen is about to launch into the details of the night her sister died. But this is 2 years ago. This is a cold case, right? So let's push pause on that. I'm going to switch over. We're going to talk a little bit about what we just read. We're going to look for some of those 6 details of a detective story. And then tomorrow we'll pick up with Helen's tale of what happened the night of her sister's death.